Pregnant black woman denied a window seat. She's the airline's new medical consultant. On what seemed like an ordinary flight, a pregnant woman found herself dismissed and disrespected for simply asking for a seat she rightfully booked. But when a life-threatening emergency unfolded mid-air, the very same woman stepped up, revealing a truth no one on board expected. What happened next changed the flight and the airline forever. Stay with me, because this story will leave you questioning how much power lies in quiet strength and resilience. The airport buzzed with a symphony of hurried footsteps, muted announcements, and the occasional burst of laughter from excited travelers. Jasmine Carter stood calmly in the check-in line, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She was 8 months pregnant, and every step she took felt heavier than the last. Her caramel skin glowed under the soft airport lights, and her tailored maternity dress exuded both style and practicality. Despite the strain of her condition, Jasmine's posture remained poised, her confidence a quiet force. Today wasn't just another flight for Jasmine. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a prestigious role as the lead medical consultant for one of the nation's largest airlines. She'd been handpicked to revolutionize their in-flight medical protocols, a mission she held close to her heart. The irony wasn't lost on her as she stood in line. Soon, she would be the one shaping how passengers, especially vulnerable ones like herself, were treated. When she reached the counter, a young attendant greeted her with a smile that barely touched her eyes. "Boarding pass and ID, please," the woman said, her voice clipped. Jasmine slid the documents across the counter with a polite smile. "I believe I've been assigned a window seat," she said. "It helps with my comfort during long flights." The attendant's fingers danced across the keyboard, her expression hardening as she scanned the screen. "I see your request, but unfortunately, we've moved you to a middle seat for safety reasons." Jasmine blinked. "Safety reasons?" "Yes, ma'am," the woman replied, not looking up. "Window seats aren't ideal for passengers in your condition. It's for your safety and the safety of others." Jasmine's jaw tightened, though her voice remained steady. "I've flown multiple times during my pregnancy, and I've never encountered this policy before. Could you show me where it's stated?" The attendant's cheeks flushed, and her fingers stilled. It's an internal guideline," she stammered. "I don't make the rules. You can take the middle seat or speak to someone else, but the flight is full." Jasmine inhaled deeply, reminding herself of the grace she'd promised to carry in moments like this. "I understand, but I paid for a window seat because it alleviates swelling and discomfort. Is there any way to reassign me to a window seat as originally booked?" The attendant's eyes flicked to a group of passengers entering the priority line, one of whom was a white woman with a bright scarf and a loud laugh. Without another word to Jasmine, the attendant excused herself and called the woman over. "You'll be seated in 5A, ma'am," the attendant chirped, her tone suddenly warm and accommodating. "We upgraded you to a window seat for your comfort." Jasmine watched as the woman glanced at her boarding pass, flashed a grateful smile, and disappeared toward the gates. She turned back to the attendant, her chest tightening with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "You just assigned a window seat to someone else," she said, her voice quieter now. "How do you justify that?" The attendant's smile returned, but this time it carried an edge. "It's an upgrade for a loyalty member. Again, I don't make the rules." Jasmine wanted to argue, to demand fairness, but she knew how these interactions often played out. The power dynamics were never in her favor. So she straightened her back, gathered her documents, and said, "Thank you," with a calmness that betrayed the simmering fire beneath her skin. By the time Jasmine reached the boarding gate, her energy had waned. The middle seat assignment weighed on her mind, not just for the discomfort, but for the principle. She'd spent her entire career advocating for dignity and care in healthcare settings, yet here she was, battling for the most basic of considerations. As she approached the gate agent, she tried one last time. "Excuse me," she said, her tone measured. "I was reassigned to a middle seat, but I have a medical condition that makes a window seat more suitable. Is there anything you can do?" The agent, a stern-faced man with a name tag reading R. Whitman, barely glanced at her before shaking his head. "Flight's full, Mom. You'll need to board with your assigned seat." Jasmine sighed and nodded, stepping aside as other passengers filtered past. She couldn't shake the gnawing sense of injustice. It wasn't just the discomfort of the seat, it was the casual dismissal, the unspoken implication that her needs were somehow less valid. When her group was called, Jasmine shuffled down the jet bridge, her steps heavy not from the weight of her pregnancy, but from the emotional toll of being overlooked once again. She took her assigned seat, wedged between two strangers who barely acknowledged her presence. As the plane filled, Jasmine closed her eyes and leaned back, her mind drifting to the roll ahead. She would ensure no passenger, regardless of race, gender, or condition, would endure what she had today. Little did she know, her opportunity to make that impact would come sooner than she expected. The hum of the plane's engines vibrated through the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. Jasmine Carter adjusted herself in the cramped middle seat, doing her best to make room for her belly, which now pressed uncomfortably against the metal seatbelt. The man on her left, wearing a business suit, barely glanced her way before reclaiming the armrest between them. To her right, a teenager with oversized headphones slouched against the window, engrossed in a video game on his phone. Jasmine exhaled slowly, attempting to center herself. She had been through worse, far worse. Years of facing both overt and subtle racism as a black woman in the medical field had taught her to pick her battles carefully. But today, it wasn't just her pride that felt bruised. It was her physical well-being. Every twinge of discomfort in her legs reminded her that being wedged in this seat was not just inconvenient, but potentially dangerous. As the plane began taxiing, the head stewardess, a tall woman with a crisp uniform and an air of authority, walked briskly down the aisle. Her name tag read C. Miller. Her eyes flicked over the passengers like a hawk surveying its prey. When her gaze landed on Jasmine, there was a faint twitch of disapproval that Miller didn't bother to hide. "Excuse me," Jasmine said, raising her hand slightly. "Could I trouble you for an extra cushion or maybe a blanket? I'm pregnant, and this seat is a bit—" Miller cut her off with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We're preparing for takeoff, ma'am. Please remain seated and refrain from requesting non-essentials until we're in the air." Jasmine blinked, stunned by the curt dismissal. Before she could respond, Miller moved on, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Jasmine bit the inside of her cheek, swallowing the words that bubbled up. She turned her attention to the small window beyond the teenager, focusing on the streaks of rain sliding down the glass. The plane lifted off smoothly, and soon the cabin crew began their routine. Miller returned, this time accompanied by a younger flight attendant who seemed less confident. They worked their way through the aisle, handing out drinks and snacks with mechanical efficiency. When they reached Jasmine's row, Miller didn't even glance her way. "Water, please," Jasmine said politely. The younger attendant handed her a tiny plastic cup, avoiding eye contact. Miller, however, turned her attention to the businessman beside Jasmine. "Would you care for a drink, sir? We have a variety of complimentary options in first class, but I can check what's left." Jasmine froze. The man had ordered a standard economy ticket just like everyone else she had seen him boarding in the same line. Her mind replayed the interaction at the gate, the way upgrades and special treatment had been doled out selectively. It was exhausting, this constant undercurrent of being treated as less than. And now, trapped in this seat, surrounded by indifference and disdain, Jasmine felt the weight of it pressing down like a leaden blanket. As the hours dragged on, the cramped conditions began to take their toll. Jasmine shifted uncomfortably, trying to stretch her legs without invading the space of the passengers beside her. She could feel the beginnings of swelling in her feet, the tightness of her shoes becoming unbearable. She slipped them off discreetly and leaned back, willing herself to endure. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her carry-on, tucked beneath the seat in front of her. She fished it out, grateful for a distraction. It was a message from her husband, Malcolm. "Malcolm, hey love, just checking in. You okay?" Jasmine hesitated before replying. She didn't want to worry him. Malcolm was her rock, but he also had a tendency to overreact when he felt she was being mistreated. Jasmine, all good, a little cramped but managing. How's Noah? Their 3-year-old son, Noah, was spending the day with Malcolm's mother, a doting woman who spoiled him at every opportunity. The thought of her son's giggles and playful energy brought a small smile to Jasmine's face, momentarily lightening the heaviness in her chest. Her reverie was interrupted by the sound of a commotion a few rows ahead. A middle-aged man was clutching his chest, his face pale and glistening with sweat. Passengers around him began murmuring, some rising slightly from their seats to get a better look. The crew sprang into action, or at least attempted to. Miller hurried down the aisle, her commanding presence now tinged with panic. "Sir, please remain calm," she said, her voice losing its earlier edge of authority. "Does anyone here have medical training?" Jasmine's instincts kicked in immediately. She unbuckled her seatbelt and began to rise, but Miller's voice stopped her. "Ma'am, please stay seated," Miller barked. "We'll handle this." Jasmine hesitated, her hands gripping the armrests. The man's labored breathing was a telltale sign of a heart issue, and the crew's lack of urgency set her teeth on edge. She glanced around, hoping for another medical professional to step forward, but no one moved. The man's wife was now pleading, her voice thick with tears. "He has a heart condition. Please, someone help!" Jasmine couldn't wait any longer. Ignoring Miller's protests, she stepped into the aisle, her voice calm but firm. "I'm a doctor. Let me through." Miller stared at her, incredulous. "I told you to stay in your seat." "And I told you," Jasmine said evenly, "I'm a doctor. Unless you'd like to explain to your passengers why you refused medical help, I suggest you move aside." The cabin fell silent. Passengers watched wide-eyed as Miller reluctantly stepped aside. Jasmine knelt beside the man, her mind already racing through possibilities as she assessed his condition. The murmurs around her grew quieter, the tension thickening like a storm cloud. This wasn't how Jasmine had planned to make her mark on this airline, but as her hands moved with practiced precision, she realized this moment might be more pivotal than she'd ever anticipated. The air in the cabin felt heavier as Jasmine knelt beside the struggling passenger. The man's breathing came in shallow gasps, his pale face glistening with sweat. His wife, clutching his hand, was visibly trembling. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please help him." Jasmine reached for the man's wrist, feeling for a pulse. It was faint and erratic, sending a surge of urgency through her. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The man's eyelids fluttered in response, but he didn't answer. The flight attendants hovered nearby, their earlier assertiveness now replaced with uncertainty. Jasmine looked up, meeting Miller's wary gaze. "I need the first aid kit immediately, and I need to know if there's oxygen on board." Miller hesitated, her lips parting as if to argue, but the urgency in Jasmine's tone left no room for debate. She motioned to a junior attendant, who quickly retrieved the first aid kit and an oxygen tank from the overhead compartment. Jasmine moved quickly, her years of experience taking over. She opened the first aid kit, her hands steady as she assessed its contents. The kit was poorly stocked, a few bandages, antiseptic wipes, and a basic stethoscope. She suppressed a flicker of frustration. This was one of the reasons she'd been hired to overhaul the airline's inadequate medical protocols. But now wasn't the time for critiques. She fitted the oxygen mask over the man's face, adjusting the flow with practiced precision. "Breathe slowly, sir," she said softly. "Let the oxygen do the work." The man's breathing steadied slightly, but his pulse remained weak. Jasmine placed the stethoscope against his chest, listening for any signs of arrhythmia. Her brow furrowed as she confirmed her suspicion. The man was likely experiencing acute cardiac distress. "Has he been diagnosed with any heart conditions?" she asked, glancing at the man's wife. "Yes," the woman stammered, tears streaming down her face. "He has atrial fibrillation and he takes medication, but I don't know if he brought it." Jasmine nodded. I need a list of his medications if you can remember them. Does he have a history of blood clots or strokes? The woman shook her head, her hands wringing nervously. No, just the arrhythmia. Jasmine turned her attention back to the man, her mind racing. Without access to his usual medication, her options were limited. Still, stabilizing him was her immediate priority. She adjusted his oxygen mask and gently elevated his legs, using a nearby passenger's carry-on bag to improve circulation. Around her, the cabin was eerily quiet. Passengers craned their necks, some whispering to each other, others watching in tense silence. Jasmine felt their stares, but didn't let it distract her. Her focus remained on the man before her, her movements deliberate and precise. Miller stood nearby, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression wavered between annoyance and unease, as though struggling to reconcile her earlier dismissal of Jasmine with the authority she now commanded. "Is there anything else you need?" the junior attendant asked hesitantly, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Jasmine looked up, offering a brief but reassuring smile. "Yes. Please inform the pilot that we may need to make an emergency landing if his condition worsens, and bring water, preferably warm if you can." The younger attendant nodded and hurried off, leaving Miller standing awkwardly in the aisle. Jasmine didn't bother addressing her. She had more pressing concerns. As minutes passed, the man's color began to improve, though his pulse remained irregular. Jasmine monitored him closely, occasionally adjusting the oxygen flow. She spoke to him softly, offering words of encouragement that seemed to calm not only him, but also his wife. "You're doing great," she said, her voice steady and warm. "Just keep taking slow, deep breaths. We're going to get through this." The man's lips twitched faintly, a semblance of a smile. It was a small victory, but it bolstered Jasmine's resolve. When the younger attendant returned with water, Jasmine used it to help the man hydrate in small sips. "This will help keep you stable until we land," she explained, her tone gentle but firm. "You'll need to see a cardiologist as soon as we arrive." The man's wife nodded fervently, clutching Jasmine's arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much." Jasmine offered her a small smile, but the weight of the situation hadn't lifted. Her knees ached from kneeling on the hard floor, and the strain of maintaining her composure was beginning to wear on her. Still, she didn't waver. She couldn't afford to. Finally, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been informed of a medical situation on board. We'll be making an emergency landing at the nearest airport. Please remain seated and follow the crew's instructions." A ripple of relief passed through the cabin, though Jasmine remained focused. The emergency landing meant paramedics would soon take over, but she wouldn't relax until she was certain the man was in capable hands. Miller, who had remained silent throughout most of the ordeal, finally spoke. "I'll need you to provide a detailed account of what happened for our incident report." Jasmine straightened, her expression unreadable. "I'll be happy to do that once he's safely with the paramedics," she said evenly, her tone leaving no room for argument. For the first time, Miller seemed at a loss for words. She glanced around, perhaps realizing how many passengers had witnessed not only Jasmine's competence, but also her earlier dismissive behavior. As the plane descended, Jasmine returned to her seat, her body protesting the movement. The teenager next to her, who had barely acknowledged her earlier, finally removed his headphones and turned to her. "That was amazing," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "Are you like a real doctor?" Jasmine smiled faintly. "Yes, I'm an OB-GYN. The boy's eyes widened. "Cool." She chuckled softly, leaning back against the headrest. Cool wasn't exactly the word she would have used, but the sentiment was appreciated. As the plane touched down, Jasmine closed her eyes briefly, savoring the fleeting moment of quiet before the next chapter of the journey began. The screech of the landing gear and the jolt of the plane touching down brought Jasmine back to the present. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers entwined tightly as if to anchor herself. Around her, the cabin buzzed with the restless energy of passengers eager to disembark. But for Jasmine, the descent felt less like an end and more like a beginning, a ripple of events she could sense but not yet see. Miller's voice came over the intercom, clipped and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have landed safely at City's International Airport for a medical emergency. Please remain seated, as paramedics will be boarding the aircraft shortly. We appreciate your cooperation." The words were rehearsed, void of genuine concern. Jasmine felt the weight of Miller's earlier dismissal still hanging between them, unspoken but undeniable. She glanced toward the front of the plane, where the head stewardess stood rigid, her posture betraying her unease. Jasmine exhaled and turned her attention to the man she'd helped. His breathing had stabilized and the oxygen mask had been removed, but his pallor remained concerning. His wife sat beside him, holding his hand tightly, her gratitude spilling from her eyes in silent tears. "Thank you again," the woman whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if you weren't here." Jasmine placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad I could help." Her words were sincere, but they carried the weight of exhaustion. She hadn't realized how much of herself she'd poured into the situation until now. Minutes later, the paramedics boarded the plane. Their arrival was swift and efficient, their crisp uniforms and calm demeanor bringing a sense of relief to the cabin. Jasmine stood aside as they assessed the man, providing a quick summary of his condition and the steps she'd taken. One of the paramedics, a young woman with sharp eyes and a reassuring smile, nodded as Jasmine spoke. "You handled this perfectly, Doctor. Thank you for stepping in." The acknowledgement warmed Jasmine, but it also brought a bittersweet sting. It was validation she shouldn't have had to earn in the first place. She watched as the paramedics prepared to transport the man off the plane, his wife clutching his arm as she followed. As they exited, the cabin broke into soft applause. Jasmine turned toward the sound, her brow furrowing in confusion. At first, she thought it was for the paramedics, but the way passengers turned their gazes toward her made it clear. This was for her. The businessman who had ignored her earlier now leaned slightly into the aisle, clapping earnestly. "You saved that man's life," he said, his tone tinged with respect. "We're lucky you were here." Jasmine offered a small smile, nodding in acknowledgement, but she didn't bask in the attention. Instead, she returned to her seat, her legs heavy with fatigue. The murmurs of admiration around her felt surreal, a stark contrast to the earlier indifference she'd endured. As the other passengers began to disembark, Jasmine remained seated, allowing herself a moment to collect her thoughts. She knew she would be approached by the crew, by the ground staff, perhaps even by the airline's management, but the thought didn't fill her with pride or anticipation. Instead, it left her with a gnawing sense of weariness. She thought of Malcolm and Noah, of their warm hugs and the comfort of home. She longed to hear Noah's giggles as he recounted his day with his grandmother, or Malcolm's steady voice as he reassured her that everything would be fine. But right now, she was far from that sanctuary. The sound of footsteps broke her reverie. Miller stood before her, her face a mask of forced professionalism. The earlier sharpness in her demeanor had been replaced with something Jasmine couldn't quite place: guilt, perhaps, or an uneasy attempt at reconciliation. "Dr. Carter," Miller began, her voice unusually soft, I want to thank you for stepping in. What you did was extraordinary." Jasmine looked up, meeting her gaze steadily. There was no malice in her expression, but neither was there warmth. "I did what anyone would do," she said simply. Miller hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her blazer. "Still, we owe you a debt of gratitude. If there's anything I can do—" "You can start by reflecting on how you treat people," Jasmine interrupted, her tone calm but firm. "Especially those who don't look like your idea of what important or worthy should be." Miller's face flushed, and for a moment she looked as though she might argue. But the truth in Jasmine's words held her back. She nodded stiffly. I'll take that under consideration. Jasmine nodded in return, her gaze unwavering. Good. As Jasmine finally stood to leave, her legs protested with stiffness. She gathered her belongings slowly, savoring the deliberate movements as a way to ground herself. The young attendant from earlier appeared by her side, her face tinged with genuine concern. "Dr. Carter," she said hesitantly, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how everything was handled today. You deserved better." Jasmine softened at the girl's words. "Thank you," she replied. "Just remember that the way we treat people matters, not just in emergencies, but always." The attendant nodded earnestly, and Jasmine offered her a small smile before heading toward the exit. As she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the cool air was a balm against her warm skin. She let out a long breath, ready to leave the ordeal behind. But as she turned a corner, she found herself face to face with a man in a sharp suit flanked by two airline representatives. He stepped forward, his hand extended. "Dr. Carter," he said, his voice deep and commanding, "I'm Richard Wallace, CEO of this airline. I believe we need to have a conversation." Jasmine blinked, caught off guard by his presence. She glanced at the two representatives, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and unease. Whatever this conversation entailed, it was clear that her actions on board had reached higher levels than she'd expected. She straightened her back, meeting his handshake with a firm grip. "Mr. Wallace," she said, her voice steady despite the swirl of emotions within her, "I'm listening." The next chapter of Jasmine's journey was beginning, and this time it felt like the stakes were higher than ever. The terminal's harsh fluorescent lights illuminated the solemn group as they stood in an awkward semicircle near the arrival gate. Jasmine Carter found herself at the center of their attention, her composed demeanor masking the fatigue settling deep in her bones. Across from her, Richard Wallace, the airline's CEO, extended his hand further, the weight of unspoken expectations hanging between them. She shook his hand firmly, though her grip lacked the usual vitality. "Mr. Wallace," she said, her voice steady but guarded. "I assume you've been briefed on the situation." Wallace nodded, his sharp blue suit unwrinkled despite the evident tension. His salt and pepper hair framed a face that was unreadable, yet practiced someone used to navigating delicate situations. "Yes," he said carefully, "we've been informed of the extraordinary actions you took on board to assist a passenger. First, let me extend my personal gratitude for your professionalism and expertise." Jasmine's lips pressed into a polite smile, but she said nothing. She had no intention of making this conversation easy for him. One of the representatives stepped forward, a younger woman with a clipboard clutched against her chest. "Dr. Carter, on behalf of the airline, we sincerely apologize for any inconveniences you may have experienced during your flight. Rest assured, we're reviewing our procedures to ensure this doesn't happen again." The words felt rehearsed, hollow. Jasmine's eyes flicked to the woman, then back to Wallace. "Inconveniences?" she repeated, her voice low but pointed. "Is that what you're calling it?" The young woman faltered, her face reddening slightly, but Wallace stepped in smoothly. "Dr. Carter," he said, his tone conciliatory, "I understand that what happened today was unacceptable. That's precisely why I wanted to speak with you directly. I believe your insights could help us prevent similar incidents in the future." Jasmine tilted her head slightly, her expression unyielding. "My insights? Mr. Wallace, I was hired by this airline to provide those insights months ago. Today, I experienced firsthand why my role is so crucial. But before we talk about the future, let's address the present. Why was I treated the way I was?" For the first time, Wallace hesitated. His gaze dropped momentarily, and when he looked back at her, there was a flicker of something almost human beneath his polished exterior unease, perhaps even guilt. "I can't excuse what happened, Dr. Carter," he admitted, "but I can promise you that it's not reflective of the values we strive to uphold as a company." Jasmine crossed her arms, her exhaustion giving way to a simmering frustration. Then what does it reflect? Because from where I'm standing, it reflects a culture that tolerates bias, dismissiveness, and a younger representative shifted uncomfortably, while the older one, a man in his 50s with a tight-lipped expression, kept his gaze fixed on the floor. Wallace exhaled, his polished demeanor beginning to show cracks. "You're absolutely right," he said, his voice quieter now. "And that's why I need your help. Not just as a consultant, but as someone who's experienced these issues firsthand. I'd like you to lead the overhaul of our training programs, including a new initiative to address unconscious bias among our staff." Jasmine studied him carefully, searching for signs of sincerity. His proposal wasn't entirely unexpected, but the timing felt more like damage control than genuine reform. "And what makes you think I'd be willing to take on that responsibility?" she asked, her tone even but laced with skepticism. Wallace didn't flinch. "Because you've already proven that you care about the well-being of our passengers, even when we didn't give you the respect or support you deserved. You could have stayed in your seat today, Dr. Carter, and no one would have blamed you. Instead, you stepped up. That's the kind of leadership this airline needs." For a moment, Jasmine felt a flicker of something akin to hope. His words were well crafted, but they also carried a kernel of truth. She thought of the passenger she'd helped, the relief in his wife's eyes, and the applause that had followed. She thought of her son, Noah, and the world she wanted to leave for him, a world where compassion and competence were valued above prejudice and ignorance. But hope wasn't enough. Not yet. "I'll consider your offer," she said finally, her voice measured. "But only under 2 conditions." Wallace straightened slightly, a hint of curiosity flashing in his eyes. "Go on." "First," Jasmine said, her gaze sweeping across the group, "I want a full public acknowledgement, not just of what happened today, but of the systemic issues within this airline that allowed it to happen. And second, I want to see tangible changes, not promises. That includes updated policies, improved training, and accountability measures for staff at all levels." Wallace nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "That's reasonable," he said. "You have my word that we'll take immediate action." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "I'll hold you to it." The conversation ended with polite farewells, but as Jasmine walked away, her thoughts churned. She wasn't naive enough to believe that change would come easily, or that Wallace's promises were guaranteed. But she also knew that her voice carried weight, and if she could use it to push for progress, she owed it to herself and to others like her to try. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, her phone buzzed in her bag. She pulled it out, smiling softly at the sight of Malcolm's name. Malcolm.